All right. So, Guy, we've been stalking each other on LinkedIn and a number of other social media channels for quite a while. It's nice to finally meet you.
Yeah, indeed, Dan.
Awesome. So I see, because we can see each other's lives online, I see from your background that you spend a lot of time in business process outsourcing, or BPO as some of the old school people call it,
Yeah.
and more recently the much sexier sounding robotic process automation, or RPA. How did you end up in a process-focused world?
Well, 20 years ago, BPO was just as sexy as RPA is now, of course. But I joined business process outsourcing pretty much when it first started.
Okay.
My background. I mean, I was talking to a journalist the other day, and they were asked me about my career, and I laughed. And I haven't had a career. I've had a collection of jobs.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
Sort of things led up to my current role. So I spent the last 20 years or thereabouts in BPO. And the thing about BPO was that it was taking work from expensive locations and moving it to inexpensive locations.
Sure. Yep.
What tended to happen was that organizations that went through this process, at the start, it was driven very much top down. It was driven by visionary CEOs of client organizations that went to outsourcers and said, "Can you run this for us?"
Sure.
So those organizations tended to be based either in the US or indeed in low-cost locations, particularly India.
Yep.
But what happened was that they became a victim of their own success. So these organizations grew very fast.
Yep.
Attrition became an issue, and they then moved from tier one cities. So someone sitting in Michigan or Manchester was 3 times the cost of someone sitting in Mumbai.
Right.
Then.
Yep.
But then they moved to tier 2 and then tier 3 cities, where you could have cheaper people providing the same service. And by the way, I define a tier 3 city as having a university but no airport. So you can train these people, but they can't escape.
Okay. Okay.
I know I've sat on buses for 5 hours getting to these places.
Oh, geez.
So from an outsourcing perspective, what tended to be missing was, in terms of the business, it was the lift and shift of that work. Mm-hmm. But the transformation was actually quite slow. I mean, there were some organizations that were extremely good at it. So Genpact, for instance, was extremely good. It's still, I think, the strongest organization in the finance and accounting outsourcing market.
Yep, I've heard that.
Accenture. But that type of business became more and more difficult for the customers to manage.
Okay.
And that's the situation that I got into. So my previous company before I joined UiPath, I worked for a BPO business.
Yep.
And we did a deal with a technology business to outsource order processing, the offline order processing for that technology business.
Okay.
And we were going to do the typical BPO-y stuff of, consolidating into a shared service operation, do lean Six Sigma process improvement, consolidate that into an offshore location so it costs less, and then provide that service back to the customer at a reduced cost and an increased efficiency.
Yep.
And the customers turned around and said, "Yeah, that's a great idea, but we've already done all of that." So of the 1,000 people around the world doing that, 98% were in best or low-cost locations already.
Yeah.
So we scratched our heads and realized that we couldn't make any money doing this because there was no fat in the operation unless we automated. And this was back end of 2013, early 2014.
Okay.
Originally, we went to see a British company called Blue Prism, one of the key vendors in the RPA space. And then we went to see this chap called Daniel Dinez in Bucharest. And at that time, he had 7 people in an apartment block in Bucharest in Romania. And the reason that he understood what we were trying to get involved with was because he'd previously worked with Microsoft. So he'd worked out in Redmond for 5 years, developing automation through the user interface for Microsoft. He had a couple of patents to his name as well.
Oh, okay.
And as a result of that, he understood that you could automate activities in the same way that you would normally do using macros across multiple systems, using the user interface as the platform.
Yep.
The company at that time was called Deskover. So we used that technology, and it was the first deal that became UiPath. And the results were staggering. So not only did they get a reduction in cost to the customer, And bear in mind that there was very little normal BPO type costs you could remove.
Yep.
But also the attrition rate of the remaining people actually went down.
Okay. Yeah.
And so you had increased efficiency, decreased cost, and it appeared as though the people actually operating on that liked it.
Okay.
So that was a pretty critical moment. And I realized that the future of work, that everyone talks about the future of work.
Yes.
But the future of work potentially could be this automation stuff. So I started talking about it, started writing about it. And then Daniel and his happy band got their seed funding from which is a German fund. And then I was approached by Daniel to join the business to help him grow.
Okay.
So I joined as employee number 27.
Okay. Wow.
In one location.
Yeah.
Wind forward to today, and we're 3,500 people across 26 countries.
Yeah.
We're number 3 in the Forbes 100 Cloud 100. The journey has just been staggering. I mean,
yes.
the growth has just been unbelievably fast.
Right. Yeah.
Still involved in process, still involved in those business processes, but now using automation as opposed to people, or a combination of both, to actually provide services. Now, we don't provide the services, we provide the software, but our implementation partners provide the service to customers who are going through that digital transformation journey. And, the digital transformation journey that we all know and love.
Right.
And a journey that has no end, by the way.
Yes, right.
So it's all part of that same mix, really.
Yep. Okay. Wow. Yeah. So I got some of that from your background, and I wasn't aware of Daniel. Well, I knew about Daniel's background at Microsoft. I hadn't quite understood the nuance there, but that's quite a story, and from an unlikely part of the world too. Seems like. Yeah,
we were the first. I think we still are the first Romanian unicorn.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was at my local pub, and our landlord knew I was in software. And there was a venture capitalist that came into the pub. It's quite unusual. Anyway, he knew of us, and he said, the UiPath is now considered legendary amongst the venture capital community.
Oh, no kidding!
Go from 1 billion to 7 billion valuation in 12 months.
Yeah,
it's never happened before.
Right. Yeah, that's wild. You never know what life is going to throw you, huh?
No, quite. It's all luck, of course.
Well, part of luck is being in the right place at the right time. So,
that's true.
Not every, so when I was at Delphi Group, we were acquired by Perot Systems. Back in 2004, I believe, 2004 through 2007. And I didn't know, I'd heard of business process outsourcing, but I didn't really understand it until I was in a 15,000 person organization that was what they did 99.9% of the time. And it's an interesting model. It always seemed a little jarring to me because I was more focused on technology and automation. Yeah.
Well, it's ironic that you were acquired by Perot, because it was Perot Systems that got me into outsourcing in the first place.
Oh, okay.
I was a recruiter. I was a headhunter, and my first customer was Perot Systems. And what was interesting was that this was their first European deal, which was East Midlands Electricity. And they had outsourced the IT, and the IT for that organization was completely shot.
Okay.
But they then put in, if you remember, these BPR consultants, business process re-engineering, to actually use the IT to transform the business.
Okay.
And as a result of that, 3 things happened. First one was the size of the deal doubled from $300 to $600 million. Second one was that the value to the customer, they went from 12 out of the 12 regional electricity companies in terms of shareholder value to 6th.
Oh, wow.
And the third thing that happened was that Perot Systems then won California Light and Power, which was $1.2 billion, which is a lot of money back then, and using East Midlands Electricity as a use case.
Okay.
So, it's Perot. It was Ross Perot and his bunch that got me outsourcing in the first place. So interesting.
Oh, wow. Oh, man, what a funny small world, huh?
It is very, very small.
Awesome. Well, so let's. So in the setup to this, I told you that so I've been really interested in evangelism ever since I first read about Guy Kawasaki, and I've had the
Yeah,
chance to talk to him and interview him. He's the most famous technology evangelist ever, probably,
absolutely.
and just an amazing guy too. I have probably a full shelf here on my bookshelf is a Guy Kawasaki book,
Yeah,
since he's written, I don't know, 15, something like that.
yeah.
And thankfully, he gave me a lot of them, so that made it easier to afford the full collection. But for people who don't know what an evangelist is, what your role as a chief evangelist, what does that mean? What's the purpose of an evangelist?
Yeah, I describe it as the best job and the worst job title in the world.
Okay.
It's the best job because as Guy, and we're both guys.
Yes, all three of us even.
Guy Kawasaki described the role of chief evangelist being bidirectional, and that's very much the case.
Okay.
Not only am I broadcasting out, telling the stories about us as an organization and the market as a whole. So it's not just, I don't just talk about us. I talk about our competition. I talk about the ecosystem. I talk about our implementation partners and how that all joins together. So it's broadcasting out. It's telling those stories, but it's also, I spend most of my time actually listening.
Okay.
So it's gathering information from our customers, from our partners, from analyst firms like Forrester and Gartner and Everest and so on, and then feeding that back into the organization, into our sales and marketing operation, into our product teams, so we can stay agile, so we can move the business to accelerate the speed with which we can normally grow. And our growth has been described as blitz scaling. So it just happens incredibly quickly.
Right.
I mean, we recruited 1,000 people in the last 100 days of last year, for instance.
Oh, geez.
Which is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So that bidirectional nature of what I do is what I really love. It's you could describe me as a storyteller because no one sells effectively by going through product capabilities.
Right.
It's how it relates to you as an individual. So a classic example is that we very early when I joined, this was early 2016.
Okay.
We put together a response for a proposal to an RFP to an insurance business in France. So I went to do the verbal presentation of going through our answers to the headquarters of this organization, and I took along one of our technical gurus with me, and so we sat there, and the room was a circular room with big screens all around the outside.
Okay.
And so we brought up the paperwork, and they said, so we want you to go through your answers, and I said, I'm not going to do that. That's boring.
Right.
Why don't you just tell me what the thing that you hate most about your job? What is the bit that you really hate doing?
Yep.
And so Christian, who was next to me, as they were describing it, that they needed to download data from Bloomberg and then update that and then transfer it to an Excel spreadsheet and then put that into Salesforce or whatever it might be.
Sure.
And he did it while they were talking. A look of shock on their faces.
There you go.
As they saw this thing, and the look of that. Thank God I don't need to do that anymore.
Yeah.
It was that revelatory, that road to Damascus moment.
Yeah.
Except not Evangelist. It is that Damascus moment that organizations and individuals have when they realize that they don't have to do the boring, mundane, repetitive stuff that they've had to do for the last 30 years. Right.
Yeah. Did you get the deal?
We did get the deal.
Ah, nice. I was hoping for a happy ending there. Well, so that's interesting. That's some interesting nuance. And I do think, having found you on LinkedIn, I think you do a especially nice job of sort of being, sort of a Switzerland sort of approach, which I think is smart. There's other competitors that are more of an attack on others or other techniques, I think. And
I think it's. I mean, sometimes I get in trouble internally for doing that, but we're all part of the same family,
right?
And we couldn't be where we are today without Blue Prism, for instance.
Okay.
Blue Prism invented robotic process automation in about 2002, 2000. Well, it was really about 2006.
Okay.
And actually, it was Pat Geary who was the CMO, now chief evangelist. We've all got one.
Okay.
Blue Prism, along with Phil First of HFS, who came up with the phrase robotic process automation.
Yep.
So, you say that success comes from standing on the shoulders of giants.
Yes.
Blue Prism has done a phenomenal job of creating a category.
Right.
And now, through our development and through the development of our partners, and that's both implementation partners and technology partners, UiPath has come out on top in the market. But that's, what's interesting is that RPA has been described as the new BAU, the new business as usual for organizations. And that's appropriate because you've got the B from Blue Prism, you've got the A from Automation Anywhere, you've got the U from UiPath, which is serendipitous. But so yes, I do talk about what competition's doing and where they're getting things right and so on, because people are interested in the broader scope and potential of automation, rather than just us banging on about how wonderful we are.
Right. No, I think it's interesting because I've been in evangelist roles too, and there can be a tricky dynamic there on, are you sort of neutral and trying to push a market or an idea that's bigger than you, and probably, I would hope, focused on customers, versus being very self-centered. And that's, I've run into situations where that was, what I thought the job was and what they thought the job was not the job. So, it's a little bit tricky. But I think that's the approach that Guy Kawasaki has taken. Although he's always been very pro whatever company he's been involved in, and he's much more aggressive than I would normally be. But there's standing for something, I think, is what it comes down to. And for me, it's really trying to stand for the customer to make sure that they're represented and we don't lose sight of that. And it sounds like that's what your approach is. Yeah,
and it's more than just the customer. I think that we think that we're moving into an automation first era. And what we mean by that is that if you think about the development of technology, it goes through phases. So it started really with the first industrial revolution.
Yep.
So turning physical human power into mechanized power.
Yep.
Through steam and so on. But if you think about the technology age, it started with internet first. So everyone had to have a website, and then it went to mobile first. Everyone had to have a mobile site, operate on mobile with apps and so on.
Yep.
And now we're in cloud first. So organizations are recognizing that public cloud is just as secure, in fact, sometimes more secure than keeping stuff on-prem.
Right.
And now we think it's going to be automation first. So automation first in that mindset is actually being driven by customers. So customers are now saying, can a robot do this?
Okay.
And they're looking at the way that they work on a day-to-day basis and say, can a robot do this?
Right.
And so we're changing from a push market where us and Automation Anywhere and Blue Prism and Kofax and WorkFusion and all the rest of the vendors are pushing their product out to the market, saying, we've got this really cool software stuff, do you want to buy it? It's now turning from those organizations that have actually inculcated automation into their business and now saying, it's turning from a push market to pull market. So as people in the organization see the value of this, not only in terms of the efficiency gains that they get, but also in terms of the employee engagement, you end up with happier employees as a result of this.
Okay. Yeah.
It's turning into a pull market. That means that the growth we've seen in the market so far is tiny compared with the potential.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And ultimately, we think that everyone's going to have their own robot. If you think that Bill Gates in the early 80s got laughed at for saying that he envisioned a time when every household and every desk would have a computer.
Right.
And Guy Kawasaki, of course, worked with Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs said, your job is to sell Apple to everybody. And he said, well, I can't do that because, the Windows users and the DOS users are all zealots. And we can't sell to zealots. We want to sell to the agnostics.
Right.
There are an awful lot of agnostics still out there.
Yes.
For automation that all of us can help.
Right. Yeah. So, so many things to potentially talk about here. Let's briefly touch on what is robotic process automation anyhow. Wow. So for those people can look it up, but so a bot for everybody. You did notice my Isaac Asimov's book back there, which I bought on purpose this summer because, all this talk about robotic process automation, there's been a lot of thinking about robots over the years, and why not go to like the master, the guy who actually coined the term, and maybe there's something we can learn from that these days. But what is RPA in a business sense? So this is not robots assembling cars or developing or filling drug vials or anything.
I mean, the industrial robots, so physical robots, car making robots, and robots for creating anything physically, have been around for 30 years.
Yep.
RPA, robotic process automation, is software robots, so it's software that runs software.
Sure.
And the difference that it makes to an individual is that it does the stuff that you find that humans find really, really boring.
Yeah.
So moving information through and between systems is what RPA is really, really good at.
Yep.
And you pejoratively, it was called macros on steroids at the start.
Yeah.
Because if you think about an Excel macro, it takes an operation of an Excel sheet and then carries out a function based on what you write.
Right.
The beauty about RPA is that it cuts across all technologies.
Yep.
All software. But if you think back 3 years ago, we had questions from customers. How do you stop the robot pressing the screen too hard? We don't have that now as the market's become more educated.
Yeah.
But essentially, the robots, they're called robots, but the software will actually run anything to do with the software that you currently run within your organization.
Yep.
There's a guy called Ian Barkin, who I worked with at my previous company.
Mm-hmm.
He is now head of strategy for Sykes and was one of the founders for Symphony Ventures, which were a service provider born to provide implementation services for RPA.
Right.
Ian described the way that processes build up in organizations as being process sediment. So it builds up in organizations in the same way that sedimentary rock builds up over millions of years. You end up layer.
Doesn't take millions of years, though.
It doesn't take millions of years. It will probably take millions of years to get rid of the damn thing.
Yeah.
So the beauty about RPA is that it acts as the bridge between those different technologies.
Yep.
If you think about it, there are 1,800 shared service operations, sort of like global business service units. So bits of companies that run the internal functions of a company. So finance, accounting, procurement, HR, and so on. Mm-hmm. There are 1,800 in Europe. 80% of those do not even have a single instance of ERP. So on that basis, and you think about all the multiple different systems that sit in organizations, particularly when they grow through mergers and acquisitions, where you're hammering organizations together, you end up with systems that don't talk to each other.
Right.
They have to have people that transfer information from system A to system B to system C.
Right.
That is what RPA provides.
Right. Yeah. So it's like a virtual human, essentially, doing the same, in some instance, doing exactly the same things that a person would do, what they call swivel chair integration from that screen to that.
Swivel chair processing is called.
Yes.
Moving information from here to over there.
Right, The only exercise some people get.
Apart from this.
Yes.
So what's changed over the last few years is that the robots have become much better at dealing with multiple different systems across multiple different operations. And so, in fact, so much so that organizations like Oracle, for instance, now have worked out that it's much faster and cheaper and more efficient to use RPA to do that final yard, final mile, however you term it, integration to their customers' multiple different and bespoke systems using RPA than it does to do that with APIs.
Yeah.
And it sort of makes sense, if system A has a user interface and system B has a user interface, you can join those things up using RPA.
Right.
And that's where our name comes from. UiPath is the user interface path. So
seems obvious. And better than whatever the title was before.
Desk over. Yeah.
There you go. So I think one of the things that I like I've done, process consulting work, and I've been involved in integration. That's a nightmare behind the scenes, rebuilding systems. And, I worked for Dim Champy when Perot Systems acquired us. We were in his office, and, Champy and Hammer Hammer especially, we're famous for. Your process is terrible. Let's just blow it up and try it again.
Yeah.
And sometimes that would be the right thing to do. I think it's interesting that RPA has brought sort of a different option to the table that lets you leverage. Like I used to have a lot of fights about silos.
Yeah.
And most people would think silos are bad because you could have the largest that I know of any client was over 2,000 when they stopped counting, and they just said, we need to stop counting and do something about this.
Yeah.
So that I think that that awareness that there's a problem, but what's the right solution? So I see RPA as at the least a way to buy back some time and energy so that you can do automation that takes advantage of what computers are capable of, and then say, all right, so now we're not dying because we've carved out this piece and it's at least faster, and hopefully customers are happier with this. And then now that we're not on fire, we can go and attack bigger issues and maybe rebuild a system or replace it entirely. How do you see it at UiPath?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And in fact, the operative word that you used was time. Okay. So when RPA started, it was quite interesting that every business case was predicated on job cuts, on headcount reduction, on cost out.
Yep.
But actually, once organizations put automation into their business, they find that what they get back is time. Mm-hmm. So it's the time is what you mentioned.
Yeah.
So that what you do with that time is material to the circumstances of the organization where they are on that transformation journey.
Okay. Yep.
Every organization has a transformation journey. And by the way, that's a journey that never ends. There is no end.
Right.
So the use of RPA in that circumstance is a really good way of giving you back time.
Yes.
And so where it interlinks with the different technologies is that because RPA is agnostic, you can think of it like an operating system. So you can put all of these automations onto that operating system, mm-hmm. and it breaks down some of the silos.
Right.
It actually helps. It doesn't do the transformation itself, but it helps provide the time and the knowledge then to do that transformation that the organization needs to do. So it's a facilitator in that way. It's not a silver bullet by any means, and it's certainly not a panacea.
Right.
But you end up with some quite interesting results. So let's take compliance and governance as an example.
Sure.
So we went to a bank about 3 years ago, and we said, we've got this great new thing called RPA, and with it you can increase your efficiency and decrease your cost. And they said, go away, we've got other things to worry about, regulatory compliance and so on. And so I thought, this is just could be appropriate. So I went to see the SEC and the FCA in the UK, and I said, we've got this RPA stuff, and it records activities and provides you down to the keystroke level an audit trail.
Yep.
Could this be appropriate for governance? I went, oh yeah, bring it on. And so we went back to the French bank and said, actually, we found a way of stopping you getting fined. And I went, okay, yeah, now we're listening. I sold to 5 French banks in 2 months, just as a result of changing that conversation.
Okay.
So in terms of, know your customer, KYC, anti-money laundering, GDPR, all of these capabilities are facilitated by a mechanistic, deterministic type software solution that the regulators like. Now, interestingly, the regulators won't countenance machine learning, because machine learning, the answer changes depending on the data set you're looking at.
Yes, right. So I see that.
So the answer that we'll give in 6 months is different from the answer it gives today, which regulators really don't like. But RPA, they really, really like.
Right.
Okay. So there's a reasonable examples of where the spread of this stuff is predicated on ideas that we have no idea about.
Right.
So it spreads through that use case methodology and that democratization really of automation that we're seeing increasingly.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. So I often see the first step that a company needs to take is they don't really know how their processes work.
Yeah.
So we need to put visibility in first. And I have an information security background too. So having visibility into what's going on very specifically is key to surviving online these days. So that's yeah. So it, you know, like that first stage, you can't optimize something that you can't even see.
Yeah.
And recording the data then sets the stage for a whole lot of things, which, you know, and like it is funny. The vast majority of consulting engagements I've done in the last 15 years have always had a governance component to it.
Yeah.
One, because nobody knows what that means if they don't have it.
Okay.
And two, it's just not fun to do. So it's not like I enjoy doing it, but I've done it enough that, you know, I can say, you know, here's some guidelines. And by the way, if you try to do sort of super tight governance, then my security background will say people will find a way around your governance. So,
humans cheat, you know. That, I mean, it's, and actually that raises a really interesting point. So when organizations start doing automation, they all have the same question, you know, where do we start? What processes do we start with? And so something like a process discovery tool or process mining tool give you that information. What we're working on now, because we've got 4 development teams in places all beginning with B for some reason. So we've got Bengaluru in India, we've got Brest in Romania where we were born, we've got Brooklyn in New York, and then we've got Bellevue in Washington. Oh, okay. They're working on 4 elements where we're baking AI tools into our platform. One of those is around process discovery, process mining. And actually, process discovery involves 2 parts. The first part is figuring out what that optimum process route through any particular process task is, and then it's based on multiple different things, and there could be multiple variances, bottlenecks, exceptions, and so on. Sure. So you have to figure out what that is. At the moment, the type of technologies that organizations use produce a picture, a map of that process and the optimum route through that. It's what some organizations call the happy path. Until I spoke to someone in the NHS in the UK, and they said, you know, we can't have a happy path for you know, when people die. That just doesn't compute. Although there's a process route there, that's not the happy path.
No, right.
So that optimum process route, once you've figured out what it is with all the variances, then you can automate it. So what we're working on is to take that data about what a human is doing, and bear in mind, having said that humans cheat, that even people in the same team who are normally doing the same task in the same way all do it in a different way. Right. Yes. And going back to our outsourcing past, that's exactly what we found. It was the knowledge transfer from the customer to the outsourcer was always had that sort of hypercare time when what you've been told was actually the way that operations worked was nothing like what it was actually happening. And it's exactly the same for automation. So you get that ultimate process. The output of that we're working on will be what's known as a XAML script, an XAML script, which will become the robot. So basically what we're building is self-building robots. So the humans will, the system will watch what the human does, work out the optimum route, recognize that there's replicable or automatable elements in that, and say, okay, I can automate this process for you now. Right. Not there yet, but that's the direction of travel. So that's the first part. The second part of automation or process mining, process discovery, is that processes always change over time. We talked about the fact that these layers keep getting built up. So through changes in technology, different systems, or changes in marketing, or changing in the way that organizations run themselves, the key indicator that something has changed is when the exception levels go up. Then you kick back into that process discovery, work out the new optimum path automatically, and then create the new robot without breaking the system. That is self-healing robots. So if you've got self-building robots and you've got self-healing robots, that's going to scale out incredibly quickly within organizations. And so that's just one of the things that we're working on in terms of the AI. So does that make RPA bots the cockroaches of automation? Well, we were talking about InfoSec. I was talking to a guy whose name escapes me now, who's one of the sort of key cryptography professors.
Okay.
We'll track his name down later. And
Bruce Schneer?
Sorry,
is it Bruce? Bruce Schneer?
It is Bruce.
Yes,
it is Bruce. So I went to see a university it was Heriot-Watt University, and he was presenting there. So I sat and listened to what he was talking about. Someone in the audience talked about how data was the new oil, and he said, "Data is not the new oil. Data is the new pollution." Because there's so much of it.
Yes.
That digging through that pollution to get what you actually need,
yes,
is actually really, really, really critical.
Yeah.
That's a good example.
Oh, see, multiple layers in here.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fun. Awesome.
Well, actually, that leads us into another thing: is that if we're going into that automation first, if everyone's going to have their own robot, ultimately, then we've got to make sure that no one's left behind. It's our responsibility, the RPA vendors and the service providers who are implementing it, and the customers who are implementing it, who are putting it into their business, to make sure that no one's left behind. So the reason that I was at Heriot-Watt University was because we've set up something called the Academic Alliance. So we've grown incredibly quickly because we give an awful lot of stuff away for free. So any organization below $5 million can use our software platform for free. And individuals and universities and non-governmental organizations. But actually, and we set up something called the our academy for training up people to develop robots in April 2017. Was when it was created. And as of, I think 2 months ago was the last time I looked, 357,000 people have been through that course.
Wow.
We've got 5 people in the Falkland Islands that have gone through our course. I don't know why.
Yeah, how many people are there on the islands?
Yeah, exactly. There's nothing else to do except play with penguins. So the academy was set up to provide training for people to build robots. Then we extended it again for the business people around to create a center of excellence or robotic operations center. And spread the communication and all the rest of the tasks necessary for spreading automation.
Yep.
Now we've extended it again. So the Academic Alliance, which is the Academic Alliance is for universities. We've committed to train up 1 million students in the next 3 years. Now we thought it was going to start fairly slowly. So what we wanted to do was put RPA into the curricula of universities.
Yes.
First of all, into the technical courses, the computer science courses, but also into business courses, because it's going to have a fundamental impact.
Sure.
A fundamental impact on the way that organizations run themselves.
Yep.
In 5 months, we have over 250 universities now signed up around the world who are actually baking RPA into their curricula.
Wow.
My quote for that is that the universities can now use UiPath to help run the universities for free. So that's where we win. But the students are now learning about RPA. And we've gone further. So we're now teaching school children. So 8 to 14-year-olds, they're building robots to play games. And feeding back to organizations, we know that people within organizations are worried about automation. They're worried about the AI and all the rest of it. What impact this is going to have on their jobs, on their livelihoods.
Yep.
So we're setting up courses for upskilling and reskilling people who are worried about automation.
Yep.
And the thing I'm most proud of is that we're starting courses to provide training to immigrants, to economic migrants, and to refugees, because we want to make them as productive as possible, net tax contributors, if you like, to the society to which they move as fast as possible.
Right.
Because that gets rid of the us and them mentality. So all of this is more than just us running a software business that wants to sell software to businesses.
Right.
Because the changes that we're going to see will be societal in their impact.
Right.
And that's not me, being my evangelist stuff. This is basically what's going to happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's happening much faster than people would have expected.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. Well, so we're chewing up a lot of time here. We covered the vast majority of the topics that I thought we would cover. So one thing, I mean, since I do think you really do, you as a person and UiPath as a company do nicely. I mean, especially based on what you're just talking about, as far as sort of giving back to the community, which also self-servingly preps people to be ready for this and to potentially use UiPath sometime in their professional future. But so RPA can do a whole lot of things, but it's not magic. So what are some areas where you think that maybe people have tried RPA and it didn't work, or just you would recommend they not do that because this is not the one tool that they ever are going to need in the future? What's an area where you could say, just if that's what you're trying to do, I would use something else?
Where you've got very fast tasks that are always the same, then it's always going to run faster to use directly. And in fact, we are actually launching an IT testing business. I mean, you and I come from you're a technologist, but I come from the services background. Most of the people that came into RPA right at the start came from services, came from outsourced service operations. So sell to business. We didn't sell to central. So for us initially, either at best as a distraction or at worst as an existential threat. Because the entire raison d'etre of a CIO is to build a bright, shiny new system with straight-through processing. If you've got that, you don't need robots.
Right. Yes.
As we heard, if 1,800 shared service operations across Europe, 80% don't even have a single instance of ERP, we'll never get to that nirvana. Right. IT was slow in order to provide what business wanted. And so business came to us, the RPA vendors, and saying, can we have some of what you've got, please?
Yes.
RPA is just as applicable within IT world as it is within business process world.
Right. Yep.
And so that's why we're setting up and about to launch next week, actually, I think, our IT testing automation business. Because that talks to IT in the same way that F&A talks to business.
Yep.
So it's applicable across ITSM, it's applicable across SIAM, and so on and so forth. That move from business process to include IT in that will really help, I think, in terms of the mind share, the mind ownership, if you like, of organizations, soup to nuts across them. But RPA is applicable across any industry and across any geography and across any service line within that industry. That's what we found, is that it can spread very fast across an entire business from where it starts. It tends to start in finance, into procurement, into HR, then to industry-specific processing functions. Okay. So in insurance, it'll be claims processing, first notice of loss, and so on, and into the front office, into customer service, customer experience, attended robots.
Yes.
One of the things I expected to happen, or I predicted to happen in November last year, was that the number of attended robots, in other words, robots to help the humans as opposed to take on the work and replace the work that they're doing, would accelerate past the unattended at some point this year. That happened in May. Okay. So not by revenues, but by number, there are now more attended robots than there are unattended.
Okay. Yeah.
And one of the things that we're working on is been codenamed PAL 9000. For those, you're a science fiction aficionado. So, for anyone that remembers 2001: A Space Odyssey,
yes,
the computer that ran the ship was called HAL 9000, HAL.
Yeah.
There's an apocryphal story that HAL was the letter before IBM in every case, so HAL.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about that, but yes. Yeah.
But HAL, for anyone that remembers the film, killed all the crew. So Brandon Knott, who runs our attended business, created PAL 9000 as the code name. So PAL is your friend; it won't kill you. So PAL
is that the tagline?
Yeah, that's the one I made up anyway. So it's not, we're not to be in a position where it's certainly not going to be called PAL when it's launched. But the idea behind PAL 9000 is that it has a mixture of both unattended and attended activities.
Okay.
So it's your own personal robot that can help you automate not only your work tasks, but also your home tasks as well. And so that's the not that we're going to launch a consumer version of our robots, but that mixture between work and home,
Yeah.
as we know because we're sitting at home, both
Yes.
blurring.
Right.
So getting that balance right is something that is going to be matter to businesses as they grow and expand and change over the next few years.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I'm so glad we made this happen. It's nice to have a chat. We can get a little deeper than just typing a sentence or 140 characters each other. So that's been fantastic. I'd love to stay in touch on this. I think RPA is. I mean, clearly it's a super hot space. And as somebody who's been involved in process stuff since 1994, completely by accident, it's kind of amazing to me to see. Like on Forbes, when's the last time you saw anything about process on the cover of Forbes? It's insane.
Yeah. Well, actually, Daniel said, that they went from in 4 years they went from 10 people to number 3 on the Forbes Cloud 100, and he's on the front cover of Forbes. Yeah. I mean, he used that word. He said it's insane.
Yes.
And the great thing about Daniel is that he's stayed humble with it.
Yes.
So the great thing about that article written by Alex Conrad, brilliant article because he really captured the man, was that Daniel spends a lot of his time actually reading outside of the subject, so reading philosophy and so on, and it's not in the sort of bullshit new work, I'm going to take over the world type thing, because he learns the whole time, and what he learns, he then spends about the business. So we're quite an unusual business in the way that our employees, we keep winning awards in terms of happiness and diversity and so on, and it's all down to that one man. It's all down to Daniel.
Okay, he needs clones. Maybe robots won't be enough.
Yeah, I think he needs clones. Actually, if you read the article, he needs clones for people to work before 11 a.m. because he doesn't actually start work until 11 a.m. You see all these reports, sort of the hustle where people work from 5 a.m. all the rest of it.
Yes.
He reads for a bit, goes back to sleep, gets up again at 11 a.m. and he works on. But it's a different way of thinking about that.
Apparently it works.
Apparently it works.
Well, I definitely don't get up at 4 or 5 in the morning to start work, but it's interesting.
Well, that's Jack Ma has been talking about the 996. So
okay.
From 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week is the Chinese way. And I tweeted and sent out posts saying that this is so fundamentally broken. It's a disease, and actually RPA can help that disease.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so many topics we could continue talking for days, months, years. Well, thanks for agreeing to the interview. It's been a great chat, and I look forward to seeing where UiPath goes and hearing more about whether it's PAL 9000 or whatever it ends up being called, but where this all heads off into the future.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.